Hello, everyone, and welcome to our February episode of Poets in Conversation. I'm Allison Adair, representing A Mighty Blaze tonight, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Ruben Quesada and DANA GIOIA. Welcome to both of you. Happy February. Before I get into my formal introductions of both of you, I wondered if you could talk for a second about how you came across each other, because I know you have an existing, at least, correspondence before this event. Ruben, do you want to talk first about how you came across DANA and DANA's work?
Sure. It's goodness. It's probably been about 30 years, and oh wow. I mean, I've never met DANA or had this kind of exchange with DANA before, and so leading up to today, I kept thinking about how I first encountered DANA's work and what really led me to spend a lot of time kind of getting to know DANA through his work, and I think it was really my time in grad school, maybe about 20 years ago, reading the anthology 20th Century American Poets on the Art of Poetry, that DANA co-edited with two other poets, and Meg, is it Shirky or Shirka?
Shirky is the way she pronounced it.
Shirky, and David Mason, and it was this. I mean, it was, oh my goodness, I still have this book. I mean, it's like dog-eared, and there's just so many notes. Like this was like a Bible to me through grad school, and I just never found a book that had so many incredible, valuable insights from so many poets over the last 100 years. And I was just in awe of such a project. And that's really what drew me to DANA's work. Is it was this anthology, and it was through the anthology that I then discovered your poetry and all the great service work that you've done with the literary arts. And so that was my first contact, really, and with DANA's work. And so so having this moment like this, it just feels like
I'm delighted too.
Yeah,
I have a much simpler story. Is that and actually, it's the way I met both of you. Both of whom were strangers to me. I was asked to edit the best American poetry of 2018, which meant the best American poetry published in 2017. And when I accepted the job, I told David Lehman, who was editing it then, I said, I want to just make it an even fair playing field. I said, I'm going to read everything. And so they were shipping me boxes of things, and I read somewhere over 13,000 poems. Every night after dinner, I would sit down and I would read for about an hour to 90 minutes. I would put them in various piles of no, well, maybe, looks good, and then just went over them again and again and again. And out of those 13,000 poems, I chose poems by each of you, neither of whom I'd met. And in fact, my friend said, oh crap, when Gioia edits a thing, it's harder to get in if you're his friend than if you're a stranger. But I simply wanted to pick the best poems possible. And Ruben had this remarkable, it was a Latin poem, but it was also a kind of mythic, emblematic poem, and it was just wonderfully mysterious and meaningful. And you could read it from almost any angle, and you'd like it. And so he sort of got into the good pile right away. And Allison, as you know, the book begins with your poem, which moved me immensely. And so now the two of you, I think, write in very different styles. But anyway, that's how I met Ruben. And then we had this big event in New York. And, and that's where I met most of the people in the book I'd never met, even though I've been in the poetry world for nearly half a century. So I think that meant that I was, either, a fairly objective reader.
It makes me think of how Emily Dickinson called her poems her letters to the world, that she communicated with people through poetry first and then sort of, if ever, met them in person. But
One more thing, I made a vow, I'll never read 13,000 poems at the same time again. But again, this is what was going on.
13,000. Well, there were some good poems in that, anthology. But, well, I do want to just remind everybody, there's going to be a lot of information about both poets in the chat, so you can follow along. But I want to do the minor work of just some brief introductions. And with both of you, I could have gone on. And in a way, you don't need an introduction, but quick introductions here. Ruben Quesada is editor of the new hybrid essay collection, Latinx Poetics, and author of the chapbook Jane La Segua, as well as Revelations and Next Extinct Mammal. His poems have appeared widely, including in the New York Times and, as we mentioned, Best American Poetry. Ruben serves on the National Book Critics Circle Board, is an associate fellow at the Attic Institute of Arts and Letters, and teaches in the MFA program at Antioch, Los Angeles, and for the UCLA Extension Writers Program. So welcome, Ruben. Dana Gioia hardly needs an introduction, I think. He has published 6 volumes of poetry, including this month's Meet Me at the Lighthouse. What have I done with it? It's under Ruben's book. Here it is, Meet Me at the Lighthouse. And as well as 99 poems, new and selected, and 3 critical collections, noting here 20th Century American Poetics, which we've already talked about, and Can Poetry Matter? Dana served as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, as the Judd Whitney Professor of Poetry and Public Culture at USC, and as the Poet Laureate of California, among other things. I've just picked a few. So again, welcome to both of you, and thank you for honoring us by being here.
Good to be here.
So I wanted to start out with a broad question. You both have several books and you've read endlessly. What did you learn from writing, in your case, Ruben, from writing Jane La Segua and also from editing the Latinx Hybrid Essay Anthology? And Dana, what did you learn about poetry from writing Meet Me at the Lighthouse? Would you like to start first, Dana, if you would?
I learned how slowly I work. I write poems only when the muse moves me. I mean, I never sit down to write a poem. It has to happen, or I just don't know what to do with it. And what I learned when I put the book together was the kind of the darkness of the themes that I did. But also, for the first time in my life, I was able to bring a lot of family history into the book. I have not written a lot of what you would call confessional poems, not a lot of autobiographical poems. My mother, in fact, and I'll mention this later in a poem that you've asked me to read, my mother told me if I ever wrote a poem about her, I wrote one very early on. She said, "No, you write about me again, I'll kill you." And she was a woman that this threat had to be taken seriously. And so a lot of these things, and I just couldn't figure out how to tell the story, especially the Mexican side of my family, which is so complex and problematic. And it happened, in a weird series of ways. And so I felt with this book, I was able to because all you're trying to do as a poet is to articulate your sense of having lived in the world. And I felt that this book really amplified it.
So sorry, how about you, Ruben? What did you learn from these 2 books that have come out in the last year for you?
Well, I think what's really interesting about Dana brought up this connection to family and this exploration of family, and I think that that really resonates with me when I was as I'm still working on Jane La Segua. The idea for the book itself comes from a Costa Rican myth that I learned from my grandmother while I was growing up. She would come and visit us in Los Angeles, where I grew up, and I remember her telling me stories, bedtime stories, and she would of course change the stories around because these myths were they're very racialized, and so I learned a lot about Costa Rican history. I learned a lot about my grandmother's childhood and what it was like to grow up in Costa Rica, a place that I've only ever visited as an adult, and so it's really allowed me to spend more time learning about my own family's history, and it's quite complicated. Just like the myth of La Segua, there is a lot of racial history within my own family that isn't spoken about, and so it's brought up a lot of really complex family issues.
Well, and about that, I read in one of the interviews that you did related to the book that you mentioned that La Segua, though there are different versions of La Segua originating, I guess, from Nahuatl and other languages, that there was potentially the use of these myths of a woman as a kind of succubus figure to try to discourage ethnic and racial mixing. And so it seemed like you imagined this to be like a very charged figure. And I think it's interesting when you talk about how examining this myth can allow you to understand your family more, because so much of the myths that are not of our family, but that sort of fiber through our family, are what kind of make them. I wondered if you could talk for a second before we turn back to Dana about your choice to update La Segua for the 1970s. And there's, maybe you could talk a little bit about the poems in Jane La Segua and how they're updated, and she's a flight attendant, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I'm currently working on this interview with another great poet named Esperanza Hope Snyder. I think she's known as Hope Snyder. And she asked me a similar question, because we're both kind of writing about our own family's past, and I got to thinking about when I was revisiting La Segua and the story of La Segua. I went through and did a search through these websites where you can find your family tree, and found that my maternal side of the family leans toward or traces back to a more indigenous family history, and so it's really difficult to find information. And I started thinking about my grandmother and my own mother, who both at one point in their lives were raising children on their own, and what kind of struggle that might have been for them throughout the 20th century. My grandmother passed away about 20 years ago, and she was born about 100 years ago or so. And so living in the mid 20th century and up to now, there have been so many challenges that women have faced, and particularly in this country. I was thinking about my own mother's immigration here, and how difficult it must have been as a woman to raise a family on your own. And on top of that, to have been a woman of color, and a woman who didn't speak the language, English language. And so I began to think how mischaracterized or misunderstood many women have been, in particular, how this myth may have originated. And it originated from a mischaracterization of indigenous people. And so I thought, how would I be able to revisit this myth in a way that would connect with people? And I wanted to focus on that mischaracterization, or how women have been misunderstood over time. So a lot of the poems I've really framed around true events from my own family, from my own mother's experience. And I wanted to find a way to put a character in this universe, or in this world, where she would encounter different people. And one of the ways that I thought would be really effective, and that really resonated with me growing up, was this idea of travel, of migration, and how could I place a figure in a situation that would enable her to travel without really tapping onto that cultural, I think, trope of the migrant. I feel like that isn't necessarily something that I feel necessarily close to, even though my family is a family of immigrants. It's not the same as many of the border stories that are being told today. My family came to the U.S. on a plane, and I thought, well, if I can focus on that idea of traveling in a space where someone can connect with other people, perhaps a flight attendant would be the best way to do that. And certainly the history of aviation and the history of flight attendants is one that was predominantly female, at least up until 1971, really is when airlines lifted their restrictions on hiring only women. So I thought, well, I want to really capture that kind of sense of oppression from post-1950s America, but I also want to highlight and illustrate how women, even after that period of gender segregation or gender disparity, is still something that exists. And so the poems travel into the future. They span about 80 or 90 years of this woman's life. And many of the poems that I'm still writing are from different perspectives. So most of these poems are from Jane's perspective, but other poems introduce other characters that allow us to see Jane in a more full dimension.
It occurs to me that you've set us up so perfectly to hear the first poem, if you would, or the first of two. Maybe if you would be up for reading Jane 1974, Jane is Cursed as the first line, before we turn to Dana and a discussion of the Ballad of Jesus Ortiz, if you would, Ruben.
Okay.
Sure, I would love to. So the poems are named simply Jane with a year next to them. And so this is Jane 1974. Jane is cursed. After the divorce, she fought two men from first class. They smiled as she passed. Then each took a turn, slapping her on the ass. She's a stone fox, one of them says. She was new, and nothing was said for fear of reproach. Alone in the forward galley of the passenger lounge, she sat, and from each side the men approached. She had been manhandled, catcalled. It was her place as a working class woman, puckering and licking their lips. She wobbled, shaken, but quickly urging them away. Hushing her still with his finger to her lips, she closed her eyes and prayed.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Dana, if I might ask you to consider the same question, maybe even in reverse. In your case, the Ballad of Jesus Ortiz was not, it seemed to me, entering of myth, but rather demythologizing something and getting an actual family history. Is that right?
It's interesting when I'm listening to Ruben's account. It's so similar to my own that I feel there's a gap of years. Now I'm a much older man than Ruben is, but I was raised in Los Angeles during the 12th century, and my people were medieval. My father was Sicilian, and I was raised in a bunch of crappy little apartments, stucco apartments, triplexes and quiplexes. And they were all Sicilian. They were all from the same town in Sicily. They all spoke dialect, and we were in the middle of a Mexican neighborhood. Every member of my dad's family, except for him, married another Sicilian from the same town, Castellammare di Golfo. He married a Mexican. My Sicilian family was extremely stable, kind of people that worked with their hands. My mother's family were destructive, brilliant people, many of whom had come to bad ends. And she had to get out of her house when she was a teenager. She was, literally, lived on people's couches and things like that. And so I had this very respectable, solid Sicilian guy, and then this brilliantly creative Mexican woman who was my mother. And it was just, they were madly in love, and they were always arguing and fighting, and then they would make up by putting records on and dancing in the kitchen. Everybody went to the same parish, where when I was young, everything was still in Latin. And so, and when I went off to college, I was the first person in my family to go to college. It was like I was going to a different planet. And I had no trouble intellectually, but I just did not understand people. I mean, they just were so different from the people I was from. And so my life has been kind of I refuse to be embarrassed of where I've come from. I refuse to cut off my roots. I'm proud of the people. It was their blood, sweat, and tears that made a decent life for me. But the question is, how do you connect that with this world we're in, which is a totally different world? And that's been true for me in every aspect of my life. And the Ballad of Jesus Ortiz is a strange poem, because when I was about 12, maybe 11, I was over with my Mexican grandfather, and my mother was very careful about when we visited him, because he drank a lot and he had a lot of arguments. So they would go early in the day, before he really got drunk. And they never let me alone with him much. But I was alone with him, and he goes, and I can't imitate his voice because it was a strange combination of Mexican and cowboy twang. And he says, "How old are you?" And I said, "I'm 11." And he said, "Well, I quit school when I was 11." And I knew that. I knew that both of my grandfathers had only gone to the equivalent of 4th grade. In fact, my Sicilian grandmother had never gone to school and was illiterate. She couldn't even sign her own name. And I tried to make conversation. I said, "Well, why did you quit school?" And he says, "Well, when my father was shot and killed, my brother and I had to become cowboys to support the family." And that nobody had ever told me. And so I tried to put this together as a story, but I knew just pieces of it. I knew it happened in a log cabin, Wyoming. 40 years later, I'm chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. I'm giving a speech in Casper, Wyoming. And I start the speech by saying that the last member of my family to come to this part of Wyoming was murdered. So I've been very careful. And I told people the story, and everybody, people liked it. It connects you to the audience. It was all the library, arts, and humanities people. And this very stern woman came up to me afterwards and began cross-examining me. She was sure I had made it up. She goes, "What was your great-grandfather's name?" I said, "Jesus Ortiz." And so where did he? And I answered all these questions, and she was really quite rude to me. Then she disappeared. And I asked somebody, "Who was she?" They said, "She was the state librarian." About 3 months later, in my office in Washington, a large stack of documents arrives. And she said, "I'm sorry, I didn't believe your story. It all turned out to be true. So I had my people pull all the documents about your great-grandfather's life, his murder, the hunt for his killer, and the trial. And suddenly I had all of the facts, the names, the dates of this family story." And as Ruben said, the poor are not remembered. They're not in the histories. That there's no documents. You write Princeton, I can get the records of somebody from the 19th century. For a poor person, you can't get records from the 50s. And so I thought I should write about this, but whenever I started writing it, it just didn't work because it just felt very literary. And then finally, this is a year later, I wrote a couple of lines. I composed them in my head. I said, "Damn it, that's a ballad." And poets don't write ballads. Literary poets do not write cowboy ballads, but that's how it wanted to come. And then I realized the ballad was the way poor people told their stories, because they didn't have to be written down. They could be recited and sung. And I remember my grandfather saying that when he was a cowboy, they would sit around the fire and they would sing songs, recite poems, and tell stories. And I said, this is the way to write it in a form that the people in the poem would have actually understood. But it's you don't want me to read the whole thing. It's a longish poem, do you? Well, I'll read. I think our moderator has lost her connection for a moment. So let me read the beginning of this. The Ballad of Jesus Ortiz. Jake's family were vaqueros. They worked the cattle drives down from Montana till Market. They did what it took to survive. Jake's real name was Jesus, which the Anglos found hard to take. So after a couple of days, the cowboys called him Jake. When Jake was 12, his father brought him along to ride. Don't waste your youth in the pueblo. Earn by your father's side. The days were long and toilsome, but all the crew got fed, and it wasn't hard to sleep on the ground when you never had a bed. 3,000 head of cattle grazing the prairie grasses, 3,000 head of cattle pushed through the mountain passes, 3,000 head of cattle crossing the muddy streams, and then 3,000 phantoms bellowing in your dreams. At night, when the coyotes called, Jake would often weep, remembering how his mother would sing her children to sleep. But when he rose in the morning, the desert air was sweet. No sitting in a mission school with bare and dusty feet. And when the drive was over, he got his pay, and then he came back to the Pueblo, where he was one of the men. 10 years on the open range, he led the vaquero's life, far from his home in Sonora, no children and no wife. Then Jake headed north to Wyoming to find his winter keep among the Basques and Anglos who raised and slaughtered sheep. He came to cold, lost cabin where the rattlesnake mountains rise over the empty foothills, under the empty, rainless skies. The herders lived in dugouts or shacks of pine and tar. The town had 7 buildings. The biggest was the bar. Allison, I'm going to stop there because it's a long poem, but you get a sense of what it is. And not to spoil the story, but my grandfather was murdered by a patron in the bar who was furious that a Mexican had asked him to pay his tab. And and it's a true story. It's a true story. And I just thought it was important, even though it happened about 109 years after I wrote the poem, to tell the story of one of the millions of poor people, who lost their lives through hardship or through racism. I'll give you one stanza, which I rather like. It's after, which is just: the tales of Western heroes show duels in the midday sun, but darkness and deception is how most killings done. And it's about 2 poor people killing each other. A theme that hasn't, unfortunately, not gone out of date.
Well, my apologies for my minor disappearance, and I look forward to going back. Well, it's funny because I thought if I can trust any 2 people to keep, entertaining everyone, I see that I'm not needed, which is good. And it struck me through hearing both of these poems and knowing both of the books now, as I do, which is lucky, that in both cases, I also don't want to give away what happens at the end of the ballad, but it strikes me that in both cases, with Jane La Segua reimagined as an airline attendant, a flight attendant, and in the Ballad of Jesus Ortiz, that both that the conflicts come at the hand of people who are also themselves passing through. There is this sort of authority that comes not from permanence, but from the pretense of permanence and greater authority, which I found really interesting in both the ballad. And so I did want to ask, again, my apologies for my sad old computer and me, but I did want to ask, and I know, Dana, you talked briefly about the ballad form and the corridos as a form that you wanted to explore. I wanted to ask a question about ideas in poetry for both of you. And this relates as well to Latinx Poetics, the anthology, and for you, Dana, 20th Century American Poetics. The other day, I was listening to a video of an interview with James Baldwin. And he said that at the beginning of his career, he had been, of course, writing quite a number of reviews and assessments of other writing. And he said he wanted to take a break and see if he himself was a writer, a real writer, not a pamphleteer. That's the way he said it. A writer, not a pamphleteer. And that really struck me and felt meaningful to me. But I don't know that I can entirely rephrase it, which is one of the reasons it's said best by James Baldwin. But I wondered from the 2 of you how you handle having an idea, the value of that when you go to write a poem or to put together an anthology or a collection of essays, and how an idea can be a hindrance or a danger to the wildness of discovering what you didn't even know you could hope for. So I hope that question is not too abstract, but how do you handle an idea?
Would you like to answer the question first? Call on one of us.
Maybe Ruben, you could start by talking about the anthology, if you would, because I'm sure you had some coherent vision in mind. So how did you shape it while still allowing for it to be self-determined?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Well, I had a great model. My exposure to essays about the nature of poetry and about writing, of course, came through the access that I had in school, grad school in particular. And as I've said elsewhere, that there are several essays in 20th century poetics written by Latinx poets. I'm thinking especially of William Carlos Williams and Julia Alvarez's essay "So Much Depends" in particular, and those two essays really led me to think about an anthology that was exclusively written by essays written by Latinx people, and so the idea of who is Latinx, who gets to be in this anthology was something quite difficult for me to confront, because the idea of borders and how we define ourselves based on borders has been something that we've had to confront for decades. But in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been such a growth of publications by Latinx poets and people from Latin America in particular in translation, that finding a way to really wrangle what I meant by Latinx poets, or how I would decide who would be represented from Latin America, became something that sometimes stopped me as I was putting this together. And something that became really clear to me was that I knew I wanted to ensure that the essays had kind of a similar heft as the essays in 20th century American poetics. And what I mean by that is that the essays really were quite thoughtful about not only placing their work in a historical context, but also revealing something about their own identity or their own experience and background, and how that impacted the work that they're doing. So I wanted both, I guess what someone might call like a close reading or critical analysis of their own work in relation to work that's come before them, but I wanted a more personal touch. So a lot of the essays in this collection, it became clear to me that I wanted them to be both academic and personal in nature. So there's this really interesting hybridization of academic language and more colloquial language in some of the essays. And so then the bigger question was, because Spanish is such a dominant language in Latin America, do I only then focus on writers who are or have a connection to the Spanish language? And that felt so exclusionary to me when I started thinking about the large population of Brazil and the number of Portuguese speakers that exist in South America, not to mention countries in Latin America that have English as their official language, or French, or other versions of hybridization of languages. So ultimately, I had to make a decision because of budget constraints, because of time, and it became really clear to me that I needed to frame this collection around the two most dominant languages of Latin America now. That would be Spanish and Portuguese, and it became poets who had a connection to the Spanish language were much more accessible to me, and those were the poets who submitted work for this project. So those were some of the really, I think, big ideas that I had to wrestle with: is who could I include, and what were some of the challenges that would keep me from including some of these poets.
And how about with you, Dana, whether in the anthologies or your critical work or in your own poetry, I'll quote one line from Natalia Trevino in her essay, Knocking on Heaven's Couplets, where she says, intention is the root of all bad poetry, which I think is sort of tongue in cheek. But I'm curious about this idea of, or this notion of an idea as both an anchor and potentially a limitation. So how do you do that?
It's a complicated question. I write a lot of prose. In fact, I supported myself as a prose writer for some years, and I write poetry. They're related, but they're different. You can put anything you want in a poem. What poetry is a way of framing language. You can make it out of ideas, you can make it out of images, you can make it funny, you can make it sad. So I don't think it's a situation like that, but I would start with, I'm a very intellectual guy, but I'm a very simple person. And most of the people that I hang around with on a daily basis where I live now have not gone to college, and English is not their primary language. Almost most of them are from Mexico or Honduras. And I know these guys, these people well. I know the families well, and they're smart, they're sensitive, they are imaginative people. And I don't want to write a poetry that excludes them. On the other hand, I don't want to write a poetry that excludes my fellow poets. And so the question is, how do you balance those two things? And I got a couple of very simple things I think about. One is that there's a lot of truths about life that we can only tell each other as stories. And so if possible, I try to take my poems, even if it's a lyric poem, and give it a narrative line. And I'd like the poem to be able to be heard by somebody who's not an artist. And they say, okay, I don't understand that. But then they start telling me what it means, and they're almost always right. I mean, they can feel what it is. I want to communicate to you through emotions, through images, through stories, through ideas. And I also want to provoke memories from you. And I want you to come in and help me finish the poem. And so the other thing I do is I try to give poems tunes. I think if you create a rhythm that you can feel, it's like people dancing with it. If you can put rhymes in, rhymes are nice. I rhyme maybe about a third of my poems. And so if you put rhymes in a poem, right away people say, oh, I like that. It's a democratic gesture. It's also a musical gesture. So I now think of myself in the business of writing songs, writing stories, and occasionally writing experimental things that only my poet friends will understand. And my work from my first book through this last book is very similar, except that it's gotten simpler, more emotionally direct, and more musical, and much more concerned about, I'd like to have the people that I came from to be able to hear the poetry just as same as the people that I've come to.
Well, speaking of which, I wanted to ask, first, let me remind everyone who's watching that please put any questions that you have for our guests into the chat, because in just a few minutes, we'll be turning to a question and answer period more explicitly and hopefully driven by the audience. But speaking of honoring the people that you came from, I don't want to curse you, Dana, by asking you to read a poem about your mother. However, I wondered if you would, as we had talked about, potentially be willing to read Tinsel, Frankincense, and Fur.
Yeah.
And then I had a question about the final line too, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, once again, both of my parents have died. I've lost a lot. I lost a lot of people in my life, including my first son. And so, I no longer believe there's a permeable wall between the living and the dead. I mean, I think what a poet does is that you work in the material world, but the physical world and the metaphysical world, you work in time, but you have a sense of immortality, and there's a kind of permeation between experience and memory of the living and the dead. Now, but in a practical sense, when your parents die, you have to deal with all their junk, and you're going through all this stuff, and you hate to throw stuff out. My mother could only buy the cheapest possible versions of anything. So I had this box of Christmas ornaments that just is wretched. My wife, would just look at these things with horror, but they're my mom's. And so this is about just decorating a Christmas tree. there's a pun in the title. You remember the gifts, you know, the Magi, the three kings, when they come to meet this newborn king, they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so my poem is called Tinsel, Frankincense, and Fir, F-I-R, you know, fir tree. Hanging old ornaments on a fresh cut tree, I take each red glass tin bulb and tinfoil seraph and blow away the dust. Anyone else would throw them out. They are so scratched and shabby. My mother had so little joy to share. She kept it in a box to hide away. But on the darkest winter nights, voila, she opened it resplendently to shine. How carefully she hung each thread of tinsel, or touched each dime store bauble with delight. Blessed with the frankincense of fragrant fir, nothing was too little to be loved. Why do the dead insist on bringing gifts we can't reciprocate? We wrap her hopes around the tree, crowned with a fragile star. No holiday is holy without ghosts.
Thank you so much. Ruben, you look like you want to say something. I don't want to cut you off if you do.
No, I was thinking about, you had a question about that final line, and I don't whenever I see, I mean, I love these lines, these final lines. It just, I always think of, when I find ghosts in a poem, I always think of the Richard Wilbur's poem. What am I thinking about?
Love calls us to the things of this world.
Love,
the
exactly,
angels on the laundry lines. Well, you know,
exactly.
Ruben and I are investigating our past, or trying to commemorate our past, our ancestors. So, you know, you're asking the dead to come and converse with you. You're asking, you know, we're necromancers. You know, we're trying to summon the spirits of the dead. And if you're Catholic, this is not, you know, if you're raised Catholic, it's not, you know, a far-fetched thing. In fact, I had a little thing in my studio I was going to bring actually up to, and I was going to ask Ruben if he'd ever seen one of these before. It's a Las Animas. It's, you know, it's a little thing that you would have in your house with it's a little cross, and has these two people, a man and a woman, praying in flames. And it's something you had in your house to remind you to pray for the souls of your ancestors, you know. And, you know, the feast, Las Animas, you know, the Day of the Dead, you know, is there. And it's just part of your childhood. You know, people are always praying for the dead. You're saying rosaries. Funerals are, you know, even, you know, as big as weddings. And it's very Latin. I mean, that's something that the Sicilians and Mexicans shared. I mean, they were in a culture, you know, which loved people to get born, to get married, and to die.
Absolutely. And all the festivals related to body parts too, you know, in Italy, everywhere, you know, where people will march around, you know, the thumb of the saint, you know, and it's a huge, there's something about that line. Well, and in fact, I think Ruben already covered it, but I was interested in this idea of every word, every image being sort of formed with this, you know, being infused with this secondary meaning, which I agree is something that is, having grown up Catholic myself, with a mother who's a Caruso, by the way, most people wouldn't guess looking at me. You know, it just is everywhere, that everything has multiple meanings simultaneously. Well, I wanted to ask you both a question about that idea. I'm turning a different direction than I expected, but related to Los Angeles. Because Ruben, you have written, and in fact, the poem that Dana chose for Best American Poetry had a reference to angels in it, and Dana mentioned the mystery of it. I too felt that there was some elasticity to the references. Both of you have written about what I think of as like the sort of spiritual coterie, you know, the images in seraphim and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering, being from the East Coast, I'm from Pennsylvania, so not even the coast. Could you tell us what Los Angeles has done to impact your writing and to impact this sense of, I guess, heritage, and that no line is without its ghosts? even the name Los Angeles seems to me a nod to this.
It's the Pueblo of Our Lady, Queen of the Angels of Portenchula. That's the name, for LA. That's why they had to shorten it to LA, and it was just so long. Los Angeles is a city that has a combination of people that has never existed in proximity and in combination before in the entire history of humanity. It's got I think of it as basically a Mexican city, because that's the neighborhood that I grew up in, but it's an Armenian city. It's the third or fourth biggest Korean city in the world. It's the second biggest Jewish city in North America. There's Italians there. My neighborhood up here is mostly Mexican, but also Filipino. So it's a huge Pacific Islander city, and they're Chinese. I went to high school in Gardena, which was the biggest Japanese city in the United States, and so it's a United Nations, and I look at myself as part of the vanguard. It's a big mix of people. People meet somebody, they fall in love, and they have kids with absolutely new genetic combinations, and I think that's rather glorious. It's chaotic, it's violent. It's Christopher Isherwood had this wonderful thing. Is people said, well, how do you? He says the only way to show people LA is just to get in a car and drive at random, and he's right. Ruben, what's your perspective?
I mean, that's so true. It's what I love and what I dislike about Los Angeles is that in order to really get a full sense of it, you have to drive and see it. You just have to see it, because every space is so different. And in many ways, now that I'm here in Chicago, the idea of neighborhoods here in Chicago and how distinct the neighborhoods are reminds me a lot of the different areas in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
I mean, Los Angeles is so sprawling, in contrast to Chicago, but I think it's that expansiveness of Los Angeles that really gave me a sense of freedom, of liberation, of wanting to interact with so many different types of people. And I think that really informed my desire whenever I engage with the world now. I want it to be so much more inclusive. And I think it has a lot to do because of the exposure of the different types of people that I had in Los Angeles, that I crave that. I crave different perspectives and different cultures and ethnicities and race and religions that you just can't escape it in LA. It's everywhere, and it's beautiful. And I think that as I begin to navigate the world and engage with other people, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for differences. I'm looking for different perspectives.
There's a fact about Los Angeles. I just want to throw this in because most people don't realize this. Los Angeles has more artists than any other city in the Western Hemisphere, more than New York. And a lot of them are in the popular arts. So the New York don't take that seriously, but it's a creative city. And I think that's probably one of the things that probably Ruben probably misses is you're there and you're meeting people that are just doing all these, that are making video games or movies or in a rock band or doing street art or writing an epic poem, and writing science fiction. And, I think it's this kind of laboratory out of which the Pacific Rim is creating its future.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of I think of a poem, Sharon Olds poem on the subway, where she sees she sees different types of people and how the subway really just crosses through different neighborhoods of different types of people, and the train brings everybody together. And I think of LA in a similar way, and how it there's so many different types of people, and in LA. You take yourself to these different neighborhoods in your car, and so in many ways it's that to go back to that idea, Ellison, that you mentioned at the start about figures that are kind of transitory in the poems. I feel like it's this transitory nature that really reveals a lot about about a character or an individual, and you know, I try to capture that in the work that I do by really, I think, examining place, particularly in my early work, and in trying to be inclusive when in organizing this anthology as well.
You know, I want to say one more thing. It was a great but difficult gift to be a poet in Los Angeles, because I had the gift of being surrounded by things that nobody had ever written a great poem about. Mm. And, you know, and so all of these things, you know, you felt like you were Adam in the Garden of Eden naming the animals. And so in this case of this book, I'm 72. It's taken me until now to be able to write certain poems about Los Angeles. But I felt this kind of joy of finally sort of getting it right.
Well, and sometimes they become praise songs. I mean, I find myself really taken by these lines in Psalm for Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. Let us praise the marriages and matings that created us. Desire swifter than democracy, merging the races. Forbidden matches made holy by children. So on and so forth. So
those are my favorite lines in the poem too. I think those were, the muse was kind to me. But I am one of those forbidden, you know, the product of one of these forbidden matches. And the Italians wanted nothing to do with my dad and my mom until I was born. But no Italian, you know, grandmother can keep her hands off of a baby. They brought my Mexican mother into the family then, because, you know, she wasn't going to just turn me over with. I'd have been happy if they just given, you know, but I'm, you know, forbidden matches made holy by children is a real idea. It's not just a clever line.
Yeah. Let us praise the grandmothers who we began with tonight and we'll conclude with too. Before we do conclude, I see we have some questions, one in particular I want to get to. Before we turn the corner from this question though, Ruben, I wondered, since it matches up so perfectly with what we've been talking about, if you might read Jane 1973, Nothing About Jane Was Plain, if you would.
Sure. So this poem draws from a line from a Christina Rossetti poem called "The Covenant Threshold," and a couple of lines from a song lyric by a band called Stereophonics. So Jane 1973. Nothing about Jane was plain, from winsome flight attendant to wife and soon divorced from a cheating spouse who ran away with another woman. She rested her eyes as she stood in the galley, her head against a wall. The plane dipped, lights flickered in the aisle. A figure as pale as the dead sang and danced. Angels, archangels, he outstripped. Salt grips the road and awaits his lift again. Street orange glow shades the odds against. At 26, she returned to work in mustard-colored wool and a matching cape, the standard uniform. She grew her hair long like before. Once a passenger commented that she was the living incarnation of Gustav Klimt's Portrait of Adele.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I'm going to turn us over to a question from one of our watchers. Connie Post asks a question for both of you. Which writer or writers have most influenced you in your writing life? Other than Dana Gioia, Ruben, would you like to go first, excluding present company?
Who's a bad influence?
You know, there's one poet that I keep coming back to, and I think it's a poet that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. A poet named Luis Omar Salinas. He has a great collection called Elegy for Desire. It's one of the few, I think, Chicano or Latinx poets that is a lyric poet that focuses really closely on nature and their love of nature and their love of beauty in the world and in people that they interact. And so Luis Omar Salinas has been a great influence.
For me, different poets have influenced me in different ways. I'll give you an example. I was in graduate school. I realized I wanted to be a poet, not a professor. And I just said, I'm going to go out and get a business job. And so T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens were very important to me because these were, guys who had actually been able to do it. When I was at Harvard, Elizabeth Bishop was my teacher. And Bishop was the poet who kind of brought me down back to earth from all this abstraction and interpretation I was doing in graduate school. And just she convinced me, made me realize the surface of a poem is the poem. The words of the poem are the poem. And that was very important for me. When I started to try to tell stories in poetry, I learned it from Robert Frost. When I wanted to write about the landscape of California, Robinson Jeffers was the person. So, different poets, if you love poetry, all these people are speaking to you. And when you need somebody, it's the beauty of dealing with the great dead. 2 a.m., they'll make a house call.
And I think we can see why you're both such great anthologists and poets with all of these different influences. So I want to thank you again. And we're almost out of time. I wanted to just say one final thank you to both of you. And also one other shout out for Ruben's hybrid collection here. I'm thinking especially of Michael Torres's essay when I hear the term a hybrid collection, because I think, there's so many of these essays that read like poetry and have the same fractures and, jumps that invite the reader to participate in their forming, which makes them feel very new also and very fresh. So thank you very much, Ruben. Dana, congratulations and thank you to you for your beautiful book. I wondered if maybe you would lead us out with one of the two psalm poems that I mentioned, Psalm and Lament for Los Angeles, or if you would, Psalm for Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. As I'll
read the Queen of the Angels because one of the things about Los Angeles is that people in Los Angeles don't know anything about the history of Los Angeles. Los Angeles was founded by a group of mixed-raced outcasts, and it's kind of stayed that way for the whole history of the town. So I talk about them, and they're Los Pobladores. Psalm to Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. Let us sing to our city a new song, a song that remembers its name and its founders, Los Pobladores, the forgotten 44 who built their pueblo beside a small river. They named the river for the Queen of the Angels, Nuestra Señora, Reina de los Ángeles. Poor, they were forced to the margins of empire, dark, dispossessed, not one of them pure. Let us praise the marriages and matings that created us. Desire swifter than democracy, merging the races, Spanish, Aztec, African, and Anglo, forbidden matches made holy by children. I praise myself, a mutt of mestizo and mezzogiorno, the seed of exiles and violent men, disfigured by the burdens they shouldered to survive. Broken or bent, their boast was their suffering. I praise my ancestors, the unkillable poor, the few who escaped disease or despair, the restless, the hungry, the stubborn, the scarred. Let us praise the dignity of their destitution. Let us praise their mother, Nuestra Señora, the lost guardian who watches them still from murals and medals, statues, tattoos. She has not abandoned her divided pueblo. She has been homeless with a hungry child, a refugee fleeing a brutal warlord. A mother, she held her murdered son. Her crown is jeweled with 7 sorrows. Pray for the city that lost its name. Pray for the people too humble for progress. Pray for the flesh that pays for the profit. Pray in the hour, pray for the angels kept from their queen. Pray in the hour of our death each day, in the southern sun of our desecrated city. Pray for us, mother of the mixed and misbegotten, beside our dry river and the tents of the outcast poor. That's
Thank
the
you
story
so
of
much.
LA.
I feel like we're going to start to levitate. It feels like a summoning. So I really, and I don't mean that flippantly. I mean that, with great sincerity. I thank you both very much personally and on behalf of Poets in Conversation and A Mighty Blaze for sharing your work with us all, and also for being in conversation with each other and such generous and warm supporters of each other's work.
It's fun to be together.
It is. Thank you.
Once Ruben is the next editor of Best American Poetry, Dana, maybe you and I will make that. We'll see.
Yeah, right.
I think you might. We'll see.
No. It would be a great outcome, but I'm not going to be a betting man and put money on it.
Hopefully we can cross paths again without waiting for that. But thank you both so much. Congratulations on all of your recent books. And I want to encourage everyone to look in the links in the chat for information about all of the books, which are available on bookshop.org, with the exception of Jane La Segua, which is available at The Offending Atom online. So you can find it there. Thank you again to Ruben Quesada and Dana Gioia for visiting us this month at Poets in Conversation. Everyone else, thank you for being here. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next month for another episode.